Louis, welcome. Lovely to have you here.
It's great to be here in Sharjah.
A huge honor, and I know that you have a very busy schedule. Tell us, let's start by just a little bit of who is UKEF? What's the background, what's the story, and to some extent, what are you doing here in the Emirates and in Sharjah particularly?
Great, well thank you Richard, and really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. A real pleasure. So UK Export Finance is the UK government's export credit agency. It was set up, in fact, the first export credit agency about 1919 after the First World War to help re-establish Commonwealth and Empire at that stage trading links. We've been innovating ever since. So we can basically provide big project sponsors with attractive long-term financing that makes sourcing equipment and services out of the UK much more competitive. And we have a range of flexible and innovative options to do that, including Islamic finance, very long repayment terms, typically up to 10 years, but 14 years for a project or 18 years for renewable energy. Capital markets, public-private partnership models, and we're very flexible about the UK content, which has to be a minimum of only 20%.
You're formerly known as EGCD, Export Credit Guarantee Department. How is before we go on to the practicalities and the specifics of what you do, how has the organization evolved over the past 5-10 years? What are you doing differently? What are your priorities in terms of the way that you want to look at projects, regions, technology, that sort of thing?
Well, most export credit agencies are there to fill in gaps in the provision of finance and insurance from the private sector. So we're not there to compete with the private sector. But what we can do is to provide access to finance for projects where it otherwise wouldn't be available by giving a government guarantee. And over the last 5 years, because of the change in banking regulation, what we do has become very much more important. Regulation has made it less attractive for banks to lend large and to lend long. And there are many infrastructure projects, particularly, that do require large amounts of money for long periods of time. So what we can do is help fill in the gaps. And quite often you will see, particularly on projects bigger than, say, about $4 billion, bank capacity just runs out. And there has to be an export credit element. And we can provide very flexible terms to help do that. Our priority for the last year and a half since I've been in charge, certainly, is to make sure that we are involved helping British bidders earlier than before so that they can bring financing along with their bids to provide equipment.
Let's try and be a little more specific in the sense of give us some flavor of the type of projects, specific types of projects on which you work and where you work. So, are you looking at energy, you're looking at petrochemicals? What are the type of things that you have done, and in as much as you're able to talk about them, are doing?
Well, look, let me give you 4 examples of what we've done within the GCC. So we helped Aramco to build its Sadara refinery. So we provided a significant amount of money to help procure UK equipment into that refinery. Similarly, in Oman recently, Liwa Plastics closed a financing on a new plastics facility that is going to create lots of plastics materials out of the gas that comes out of the Omani fields there. And then more closer to home, Blue Waters, Emirates development, we certainly helped finance that. And most recently, actually, we announced our first transaction for a little while in Sharjah. Hopefully it'll be the first of many, where we are offering the finance to BR, the waste management company, to help build their new headquarters, which is a fabulous state-of-the-art sustainable building designed by Zaha Hadid architects out of the UK and to be constructed by Carillion, which is a UK construction company.
Thank you. There's been, traditionally, the UK has been seen as being good in certain sectors, and people like Rolls-Royce providing turbines and all sorts of things like that. And the aerospace and defence sector, there have been a few large corporates that have dominated the environment. But increasingly, we are seeing that the UK economy, the UK businesses are much more about the sort of value added, about the technology, about the process, the project management, as opposed to the actual physical construction or manufacture of things. Now, how does that play to an organization like UKF? I mean, you talk about Carillion and Zaha Hadid, and those are, that architectural practice is very much of a brain-driven, knowledge-driven enterprise. How do you sort of fit into that new structure of the UK environment?
Well, Richard, as I go around the UK, I am constantly amazed by how much we do actually make and the quality of it. So there's a lot of manufacturing goes on in the UK. A lot of things are built. And we can help you to access all of that supply chain. I'll talk about that in a minute. But you're right, the UK is also a tremendously creative economy, developing huge amounts of intellectual property, providing very, very high quality services, whether it's design, architecture, education, financial advice, accounting, all sorts of things. And the good news is that what we do is not limited only to financing goods, but also services and intellectual property as well, and giving the owners of intellectual property comfort when they license their IP abroad that they're going to get paid for that license. So we're an organization that is willing to adapt to the way the British economy is. We certainly have huge service and intellectual property exports, but also huge physical goods exports as well.
Let's stay, just before we go back to the physical and the supply chain, let's stay with the intellectual property side of things and the soft services, or maybe not soft, the services aspect of it. Just explain how that actually works. I mean, if I was a UK company supplying services to the GCC, to Sharjah, I wouldn't, I really wouldn't start by thinking, well, I'll go to you guys for the financial side of things, because often the service provision doesn't need a lot of upfront capital. It's more of an ongoing payment thing. So how do you work in that sector? I mean, it's not a traditional thing for an ECA to work in.
Well, quite a lot of times the service is embedded in a big project. So if we take an airport, any given airport project around the world could be at least 20% UK content, from the design and engineering through baggage handling, air traffic control management, designing the flow control of people through an airport, all the security equipment. So there's services and goods in that package, and we're very willing to finance that. In terms of services, you're right, they don't often lend themselves necessarily to long-term financing of 10 years or so, but we're doing a large transaction for a GCC country at the moment, a sovereign, who wants to spread the cost of a services contract over a longer period of time, and we're giving them between 3 and 5 year financing to pay for services which normally you would think of as paying on an as-consumed basis. But we're very happy to look flexibly at that.
Before we go to the sort of, well, actually, no, let's do the supply chain stuff. I mean, you mentioned the word supply chain. Again, part of what is happening in the GCC, initiatives such as IKTVA, which is the In-Kingdom Total Value Added program of Aramco in Saudi Arabia, they're very keen to bring onshore their own supply chains. And they are providing, preferential treatment, I think is the way, for international companies that locate onshore. So that's one way in which the supply chain in this part of the world is changing. But what do the words supply chain mean for UKEF, and how are you involved in that particular area?
So I think that the issue for any big project sponsor who needs to find financing and ends up thinking that the ECAs are a good place to go is, how do I satisfy the local content requirement to get that ECA finance? So let's just assume you're managing a big project and you need $200-300 million from UK Export Finance. What we can do is bring you into London with your procurement contractor, and we will be there with our offer of financing, and we will invite the UK supply chain to meet you and your procurement contractor, and they'll hear how real the project is, that there's UK government financing behind it, so they'll get paid. And our experience has been that all these British companies start queuing up to talk to your procurement contractor to make sure that they are embedded in the supply for that project. But Richard, you also mentioned the other end, which is onshoring into the GCC of business. And again, we can help with that. So we can make British companies feel more comfortable about investing abroad by offering them overseas investment insurance if they're worried about the viability of their project. So we can help both with outward direct investment from the UK as well as helping you to procure from the UK for your project.
Let's talk now less about the specifics of UKEF and more about the markets in the region and the sectors that are exciting. You see a lot of transactions, you see a lot of deals. I know that you're the CEO, so you probably don't see all of them, but you must have, as an institution, quite a good feel for where the capital is flowing. Unfortunately, you weren't able to be here earlier on when we had a long discussion about the macro position of the region, but in a sort of couple of sentences, we said we thought that the low oil price environment had actually been a very strong wake-up call. And despite the fact that, yes, it is difficult for some economies to make a transition to a more sustainable economic balance within their sectors, it was a good thing that it was going to happen. How do you see the region in terms of opportunities for Britain and for British businesses, your clients? And how do you see the UAE and Sharjah? I mean, what's your position on that?
Well, I think we see a structural change, not just a cyclical change, and that's driven by the price of oil. I don't think, have a particularly sort of radical view on oil, which is that it's likely to be reasonably stable at around $50 for quite some time. And that brings with it challenges for the GCC economies, where budget deficits are quite large. Diversification of the economy becomes an imperative, not just an option. And we can really help to achieve that diversification, create the infrastructure that allows it to happen, create the industrial facilities that will spawn other industries. We're looking at a petrochem plant, for example, not GCC, but Egypt, which will increase that country's foreign exchange earnings by 50% alone, and will spawn a plastics industry and all of the secondary industries that go beyond that. So I think that this is something we see in terms of the structure, the sectors rather, where we think this is going to play out most, and where the UK is most relevant. Well, we think that defence and security is something that's going to continue to be very important. Aerospace, water, construction, airports generally, education particularly. So all of these sectors, the UK has a high degree of expertise in. And that expertise is more readily available with support from export credit.
You mentioned, there's a couple of points within that I'd like to pick up, but the first one that struck a chord in my mind was, you said budget deficits, which, appeared, but are reducing. But there are financial constraints regionally. I'm not talking specifically about Sharjah or indeed the UAE, which is on balance in a slightly better position than some of its regional peers. So what previously could have been financed from effectively the government purse, and we've seen this with power plants in Saudi Arabia where they did IPPs and then they decided, well, why do that? We can just, procure it. Are you seeing now a change in the region where people are saying, yeah, we actually need to look at different ways of financing projects? So they are perhaps more receptive to ECA funding. I mean, you mentioned banks not being in the market so much, and that's certainly true. A lot of the main banks have pulled back from the region. Project finance is difficult to get. So, you use the word structural, not cyclical. Are you seeing, as a result of better financial management within GCC governments, and indeed the private sector, that this provides you with opportunities that weren't there perhaps 3-4 years ago?
Well, there's certainly a change in the nature of the opportunities we're seeing. We're needed more. So just paying out of cash for a petrochem plant when you could actually instead spread the cost over 10 years, release some budget in the shorter term to do other things. all of these techniques are now being employed much more by GCC governments, and just this year we have seen effectively a capital markets yield curve for most of the GCC from 5s out through 30s. Very, very interesting to see that. And so I think that the options being sought by governments are broadening out very much. We can absolutely help with that as well. So in fact, we can guarantee issues in the capital markets. We can effectively make contingent liabilities, take contingent liabilities onto the UK government's balance sheet to ease the burden on GCC governments. So we can do project financings, and to your point, actually, we find project financings working very well. Liwa Plastics in Oman particularly is a most recent example that we saw. All of this is I think, very positive.
You're a former banker. Well, maybe, arguably you're still a banker of sorts now, but
once a banker, always a banker.
Yeah, I know. Well, that's right. We all have our things to bear, don't we? But seriously, the regional, the international banks here do not want to put balance sheet into projects. They're happy to do the structuring and the advisory and the fee work, but in terms of balance sheet, if very, very few lenders are that important that they will put balance sheet on it. Do you feel that you've sort of replaced the private sector banks in that role, or is it something slightly different?
Well, we will never replace the banks, and we work generally with banks as partners, and what we generally do is give them a guarantee on a loan they make, so that instead of lending to a project or to a sponsor or to a company, they're effectively lending to the UK government. That is zero risk weighted, and they are more willing to do that. So they effectively become liquidity providers at that point. And that is a very attractive thing, and we can also do some element of direct lending ourselves, providing cash. And a structure that is working quite well is where you need 10-year money. We will create a 2-tranche deal. The first tranche is a bank unguaranteed tranche, and they will get paid down over the first 5 years, and we will lend for the back 5 years. So you get effectively 2 tranches. We manage to help the banks to meet their requirements of lending shorter, yet meet the project's requirements of having long-term financing.
But yes, the long-term financing, we've already talked about that. We have the time just disappears. I don't know what it is. I'm sure time goes faster on stage than it does normally. The title of this conference is Finance and Investment for an Innovative Economy. If we focus on that, the back end of that sentence, innovative, how do you fit? We talked a lot this morning about the new world of technology, digitization, how Sharjah and the UAE have to move their strategy towards one of digital integration and that type of thing. Where do you, traditionally you're known for what might be called sort of heavy industry.
Big kit. Big
stuff, How do you fit into that new world of the digital market? Or do you not? Or are you just unreservedly big stuff?
No, we're absolutely not unreservedly big stuff. As I talked about, services and intellectual property as well as big stuff. There's several expressions these days which sometimes disguise more than they actually reveal. Digital is one, and smart cities is another. But there is a huge amount of smart city technology coming out of the UK that really goes into bigger bits of infrastructure that other countries will probably do more effectively, but can be made better with that UK technology injected into it. So, for example, UK export finance has very little role to play in China because most big projects are state-backed and they don't need our guarantee. But China is bidding for many, many big infrastructure projects. Their constructors are very cheap and all that kind of stuff. But some of those projects really need British technology in there. On the control systems, on the design, I talked about designing airports and train stations and the flow control of people through those. There's a lot of British expertise can be embedded in a lot of other people's kit. Yeah. And we're very keen to work on.
So that sort of technology aspect is very much there, very much part of the way that you see the future of your organization.
We have to be responsive to what the UK economy is doing as well as the rest of the globe. And the UK economy is a creative economy full of technology, and we need to help support that.
Well, I'm sure, I mean, we've run out of time, but I'm sure that we'll see you again in the region. We'd be very happy to see you at other events, but it's marvelous to have had you here, and it's a real testament not just to you, but to Sharjah and the UAE as an important target market for the UK and for UKEF as we move forward into the future.
Richard, is there one
Please.
point I'd just like to make? That
Please.
I've talked about guaranteeing financing, but I'd just like to make it clear, it's not just dollars and sterling and euro. We can actually guarantee financing in dirhams as well, and all of the GCC currencies.
Well, I hope you're swamped by people as you stand up asking you for money. I know that actually you have a meeting that you need to go to, and the clock is finally flashing at us. So seriously, enormous thanks for coming. I know that it's been a very busy day, and stopping by here and talking to us is very good, and we do hope to see you again. Please join me in thanking Louis Taylor for his presence and his comments.
Thank you.